In October of 1881, in the mud of a Miles City street, a woman fell to her knees in front of a man she had never met. Her coat was too thin. Her glove was worn through. She had one trunk tied shut with a piece of rope, and she looked up at him and said, "Sir, I can cook. I can clean. I do not eat much. Please don't send me back. There is nothing to go back to." The man was 6 feet 5 inches tall, a former cavalry officer, a rancher with a brother just 3 weeks in the grave. The whole street was watching. He had every right to walk away. Instead, he knelt down in the mud beside her. Welcome to our channel, where we share stories of the old American West, of cowboys and the women who walked beside them, of mothers who lost and rebuilt, of strangers who became family across the long winters of the frontier. This story will teach you something the old hymns forget to say: that asking for help is not weakness. Asking is courage, and the right kind of man will always kneel down to meet you there. If this story moves you, please hit like, drop a comment below, and subscribe so we can ride this trail together.
The October wind in Miles City was not like the wind anywhere else in America. It came down out of Canada, traveled 200 miles across treeless grass, and by the time it reached town, it was no longer wind. It was something with teeth. Jeremiah Sutton knew that wind. He had lived with it for 34 years. That morning he stood beside his wagon in front of the stage depot, collar turned up, waiting while the hands loaded a crate of barbed wire and a sack of alfalfa seed for spring. In the inside breast pocket of his coat, he carried a letter from his brother's attorney. He had been carrying it for 3 weeks. He had not opened it. He did not plan to open it that day. He planned to drive home, cook a small supper, sit by the stove with his brother's dog, and pretend for one more night that Caleb was only away on a trip. Then the bell of the inbound stage rang behind him. He turned his head without thinking. A woman stepped down. Black travel coat, too thin for October, right glove worn through at the little finger. He saw it because she reached up to hold her hat against the wind. Honey-colored hair pinned up awkwardly, the way a woman pins her own hair after 3 days on a stage with no mirror. A battered trunk at her feet. Its handle had been replaced with a length of rope. One trunk, just the one. And her eyes. Jeremiah had seen those eyes once before in his life. On a young soldier after the Battle of the Big Hole, when the boy had sat beside his dead friend and stopped being able to cry. The eyes of someone who had finished crying. She spoke to the station agent in a low voice. The agent pointed toward Jeremiah. She came across. She held out a folded paper. "Sir," she said, "I am looking for a Mr. J. Sutton. Would that be you?" He took the paper. He read it. The signature at the bottom of the page was his brother's. He knew the crooked, boyish slant of the letters because he had taught Caleb how to write them when the boy was 7 years old. His hands went cold. He stood still for about 10 seconds. He took in everything. The trunk, the rope handle, the torn glove, the eyes. He understood that she had traveled some road that a person only travels when there is no other road left, he said, and his voice came out drier than he meant. "Ma'am, my name is Jeremiah Sutton, the man who wrote this letter, the man who sent for you. He was my brother, Caleb. He passed, ma'am, 3 weeks back. I did not know he had done this. I am very sorry you came all this way." He said it slowly, because he knew each word would land like a blow, and he did not want to hurry a blow. Hannah Calloway stood still. 1 second, 2, then her knees gave out. It was not a faint. It was not theatrical. It was simply a pair of knees that could not hold up one more piece of news. She went down in the cold mud of the Miles City street, right in front of Jeremiah, in front of 2 men loading the wagon, in front of a woman in a fine bonnet passing by with a basket of eggs. She did not look up. She stared down at his boots. Her voice was so quiet that only he could hear. "Sir, I can cook, I can clean, I can mend a shirt, I can tend a garden, and I can nurse a sick man. I do not eat much, sir. I have no one in St. Louis. I have no money for a ticket back and no place for the ticket to take me. I will sleep in a barn. I will work for nothing but a roof over my head and bread in the morning. She drew a breath. Please, sir. Please, don't send me back. There is nothing to go back to. The bonneted woman stopped. She looked. She whispered something to the woman walking beside her. 2 words that Jeremiah caught. 2 words that heated the blood in his face. That sort. The woman walked on. Jeremiah looked down at the woman kneeling in the mud. He looked at his own hands. Hands that had fired rifles at living men. Hands that had buried his brother 3 weeks back. Hands that had lifted a pine coffin lighter than he had expected. He did not know what else those hands still knew how to do, but he knew they could not leave a woman on her knees in the mud. He pulled off his buffalo hide coat. The coat was heavy enough to weigh nearly as much as a child. Then slowly, because he was a large man and all his movements were slow, he knelt down. Both knees sank into the mud directly across from her. People watched. He did not care. He settled the coat around her shoulders. The coat was so broad it nearly covered her whole frame. He spoke so quietly that only she could hear. "Ma'am, look at me. Please look at me." She raised her face. Her eyes were red but dry. "You do not kneel for anyone in this territory. Not for me. Not for any man, not ever again. Do you hear me, ma'am?" She gave the smallest nod. "We are going to stand up together now. Slow. I have your arm. We will sort the rest on the way home. You are not going back, ma'am. You are not going back." And he stood, and he lifted her to standing beside him. And in the mud of the Miles City street, the mountain of a man and the broken woman rose to their feet at the same moment. He settled her on the wagon's passenger bench. He tucked a heavy wool blanket over her legs. He said nothing for all 18 miles of the drive home. Neither did she. But as the wagon crossed the wooden bridge over the Bitterroot Creek, the wind paused for a single breath. And in that breath, he heard her whisper, not to him, to herself. The way a woman says a prayer she has said so often she no longer hears it. "I had a daughter. Her name was Ellie. She would have been 2 this winter." Jeremiah tightened his grip on the reins until his knuckles went white. The unopened letter from the attorney still weighed inside his coat pocket. 3 deaths rode home with them on that wagon. A brother, a baby girl, and something in his chest that did not yet have a name. The wagon pulled up to a 2-story log house, bigger than Hannah had pictured. A double-pitched roof, a wide porch. But the house felt empty. Not for lack of furniture, but because no one had walked through those rooms for a long while. Jeremiah led her inside. The floor was clean. The kitchen was clean. But there was the smell of a house where a man had lived alone. Wood, leather, cold smoke, no bread, no dried flowers. None of the small smells a woman leaves behind. On the mantel over the stove sat an old tintype photograph. Hannah stepped closer. 2 men side by side, the taller one broad across the shoulders with a serious face, Jeremiah. The smaller one, fair-haired, grinning like a boy of 17, though he must have been near 30. That was Caleb, the man who had written her 5 letters, the man who had promised her an honest house and an honest life, the man who had died before she could thank him. She looked at the photograph a long time. She did not cry, but she laid her hand on the frame softly, the way a person lays a hand on the shoulder of a friend who has gone far away. Jeremiah stood at the stove. He filled the coffee pot from the water bucket. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the pot. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll say what I can offer, and you'll say yes or no, and we will go from there. Is that all right?" "Yes, sir." "There is a bedroom upstairs. It was my mother's. She passed 10 years ago. It's been kept clean. It will be yours. The door has a lock. The key is in the drawer of the nightstand. That key is yours, and no one else's." He paused. He set the coffee pot on the stove. I will not take a wife I do not know, ma'am. I will not do it. And I will not send a woman out in October with nothing. I will not do that either. So here is what I propose. He turned the handle of the stove door. You stay in the house. You cook what you want to cook. You keep the place however you want to keep it. The garden in spring, if you have a mind for it. I pay you $1 a week, room and board on top of that. 6 months from today, if you want to leave, anywhere in this country, I will pay the fare, and I will send you with enough to start over. He stopped. He looked at her for the first time since they had come inside. No strings on any of it. You are not my wife, ma'am. You are not anyone's wife unless you choose to be. That's the offer. Take the night to think on it. Tell me in the morning. Hannah did not need a night, but she nodded. Because she understood that he was not giving her the night to decide. He was giving her one night in her life in which no one was waiting for her answer. That was a gift. Thank you, Mr. Sutton, she said. He nodded. He handed her an oil lamp. He showed her the stairs. He said good night, and he walked out to the porch. She went up to the room that had belonged to his mother. The room was clean. White linens on the bed. A pieced quilt folded across the foot. She recognized the needlework at once as the work of a dead woman, because the little irregularities in the stitching were the kind a person leaves when she sews at night under a weak lamp. She did not take off his coat. She wrapped it tighter around her. She sat by the window and she looked out at the pale sweep of frost on the grass. Then she heard it. Heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, stopping outside her door. 5 seconds. No knock. No word. Then the footsteps went on down the hall to the far end. She understood at once. He had stopped to make sure she was still breathing. That was his way of saying, ma'am, you are safe in this house, without using a single word. Hannah placed her hand on her stomach, where Ellie had once been. For the first time in 11 months, she did not force herself to sleep. She only let her eyes close. And for the first time in 11 months, she slept nearly 5 hours without dreaming. When she woke, the sky was only beginning to turn gray. She heard hammering outside. Jeremiah had been up for a long while, nailing back a board that the night wind had pried loose from the barn. She went down to the kitchen. She started coffee. She mixed biscuits from the flour she found in the tin. When he came in, he stopped in the doorway. He had not smelled coffee and fresh biscuits in that kitchen for 10 years. He did not say anything, neither did she, but she poured coffee into a tin cup, set it down at his place, and stepped back. He sat. He took a swallow. He closed his eyes for a second, then he opened them, looked at her, and said, "Yes, ma'am." She did not understand. "To your answer," he added, "whatever it is." "Yes." She smiled. The first smile since she had set foot in Montana. Small, only one corner of her mouth, but a smile. "I'll stay, Mr. Sutton," she said. 6 months. We'll see. He nodded. He drank down the rest of the coffee. He stood up to start his day. And that is how the first week began, not with a thunderclap, but with a cup of coffee. The first Monday, Hannah learned to milk a cow. The cow slapped her in the face with its tail. She did not cry. She wiped her cheek and tried again. Jeremiah watched from outside the barn and did not go in to help, because he understood that she needed to do it herself. By the end of that morning, the bucket was half full. The first Thursday, a skinny Irish boy came to the kitchen door, took off his hat, and said, "Mrs. Calloway, ma'am, I'm to show you the hens, if it please ye." This was Finn Callahan, 17 years old, orphaned in the cholera epidemic of '78. He worked at the ranch for board and $3 a month. He spoke English with a heavy Cork accent, and when he came to a difficult word, he stammered. Hannah listened patiently. When he stammered, she never called attention to it. She only nodded and waited. By the time he had shown her the third hen, Finn had stammered less. He said as they walked back to the kitchen, "You listen, ma'am. Not many folk listen." She said, My father was a school teacher, Finn. He taught me that the quickest way to learn a person is to listen to them finish." Finn thought about that. Then he said, "Aye, that's a fine thing." He would remember that sentence for the rest of his life. The first Sunday, Hannah came down to find old Thomas sitting alone outside the barn. Old Thomas was the ranch's cowhand, a black man of 60 years, born enslaved in Alabama, freed by Union troops in 1865, walked west with nothing but the clothes on his back and the Bible his mother had taught him to read in secret when he was a boy. He had worked for Jeremiah's father for 9 years, and for Jeremiah after that. Jeremiah and Finn had ridden to church in Miles City. Thomas had not ridden with them. Hannah asked why. Thomas smiled, a quiet smile. The smile of a man who had made peace with things long ago. "Mrs. Calloway, ma'am," he said, "the Methodist Church in Miles City don't seat a black man in the main pews. They got a back row for my kind. I prefer my own Bible, ma'am. It reads me the same words." Hannah said nothing at that moment. But that evening, she took from her trunk her own mother's German-Latin parallel Bible. She set it on the kitchen table, where Thomas passed every day when he came in for water. By the next morning, the book had been read to page 30. No one spoke of it. But from that week on, Thomas and Hannah read from the same book. The third Wednesday, Hannah found the recipe book of Jeremiah's mother in the cupboard. She cooked a stew from it. Beef and wild thyme and turnips, the kind of stew a ranch woman cooks on a winter night when the menfolk come in tired. That evening, when Jeremiah took the first bite, he stopped mid-motion. His eyes reddened for 1 second. He did not say anything. He nodded, and he went on eating, slower now. Hannah understood at once. This was the dish his mother used to cook on winter nights. She said nothing. She only ladled another spoonful onto his plate. After the meal, he said, "Thank you, ma'am, that was kind," she answered. The first time she did not call him sir. "My name is Hannah, Mr. Sutton." He nodded. "Jeremiah," he said. It was the 23rd night in the house. By the end of the first month, Hannah had learned the names of all the chickens. She had mended 3 of Jeremiah's shirts where the stitching had given out. She had taught Finn to write his own name in a clear hand. She had baked bread twice a week. She had sung to the old mare Ruby until the horse fell asleep standing with her head on Hannah's shoulder. Jeremiah came home early one afternoon. He stopped at the barn door. He saw Hannah beside Ruby. He heard her singing, a lullaby in English with a few German words her mother had taught her. The horse had fallen asleep with her head resting on Hannah's shoulder. Jeremiah stood there for 7 full minutes. He did not go in. He thought, any woman a horse will sleep on cannot be a bad woman. He turned away quietly and took the long way around to the house so she would not know he had seen her. That night, he took the attorney's letter out of his coat pocket. He set it on the mantel. He did not open it, but he no longer carried it against his chest. A small step. In the 4th week, Hannah asked permission to clean Caleb's room. Jeremiah nodded without speaking. He walked out. He did not come back to the house until nightfall. Hannah went in. The smell of old paper, the smell of horse leather, a banjo leaning in the corner, a pair of boots smaller than Jeremiah's, a shirt folded over a chair, as if the owner had only just stepped out to the yard. She worked slowly. She threw nothing away. She folded. She stacked. She dusted the way a person dusts for a sleeping child. In the drawer of Caleb's writing table, she found a stack of letters, 5 of them, written, sealed in envelopes, stamped, never mailed. Each one addressed to Miss Hannah, St. Louis. She sat down in the chair. She read them one by one. The first letter, Caleb wrote about Montana, about the spring, about the bluebells along the creek. The third letter, Caleb wrote about his brother. "Miss Hannah," he wrote, "I ought to tell you the truth before you come. My brother Jeremiah owns half this land. He is a mountain of a man, but he has the heart of a preacher. He just does not know it. He thinks the war broke him. It did not. He is only tired. Pay him no mind if he goes quiet. He listens more than he talks." The 5th letter. The last one. Written 2 days before he died, never sealed. "Miss Hannah, I have been thinking. I asked you to come because I was lonely, and because the winters up here are long, and because I read your letter and thought, this woman has lost too much and so have I, and perhaps we might hold each other up through a few winters and call it enough. But I want to tell you something before you board that train. If when you arrive you find that my brother suits you better than I do, I want you to know with all my heart that I will not hold it against either of you. I will step aside and bless you both. A man does not choose a wife the way he chooses a horse. Come and see. We will all see. Hannah set the letter down. She cried. The first time in that house she cried aloud. She cried for Caleb, who had died unmarried, who had written those generous words no one had read in time. She cried for herself, because for the first time in her life a man had looked at her as a person with the right to choose, not as a thing that had been shipped. She folded the 5 letters together. She placed them in her trunk. She did not give them to Jeremiah at once. Some gifts have to wait for the right moment, or they become wounds. Late that same afternoon, Finn came to the kitchen door and asked Hannah a shy question. He could not read. He wanted to learn. Would she teach him? Hannah sat down. She said, "Finn, it would be my honor." When Jeremiah came home that evening, he found Finn and old Thomas both seated at the kitchen table, each with a book. Hannah standing behind them, pointing to letters one by one. Thomas had some reading already, but he wanted to read better. Jeremiah stopped in the doorway. He did not go in. He understood what he was seeing. This woman was teaching 2 grown men to read in his kitchen. One, a black man who had been born a slave. One, an Irish boy who had been orphaned. Neither of them would ever sit in the center pews of the Methodist church. He stepped out to this porch. He sat down on the top step. He thought of his own mother, how she had taught him and Caleb to read by the stove. He thought of the letter on the mantel. He still had not opened it, but he had stopped being afraid of it. Silas Harlan came on a Sunday afternoon in late November. He was 55 years old, owner of the Bar H, the largest spread in the valley, widowed, 1 son studying law in Chicago, connections to 3 territorial legislators. For 10 years, he had been trying to buy the Double S because it controlled the stretch of Bitterroot Creek that his cattle depended on in dry summers. Jeremiah's father had refused to sell. Jeremiah had refused. Caleb had refused the week before he died. Harlan was not evil. He was simply a man who believed that whoever owned the most land ought to have the most voice. He rode in with a young lawyer at his side. The 2 men drank coffee on the porch. Harlan made 2 offers very politely. The first was a new price on the north pasture, double the market rate. The second was a small piece of concern between 2 old neighbors. "Jeremiah," Harlan said, "I heard something from a banking friend in St. Louis last week. This woman you've taken in. Her husband was an embezzler. She was under investigation, no charges yet, but under investigation all the same. A man like you, with the honor of a former officer, does not need a woman with a history behind her." He set his coffee cup down softly. "Send her back. I'll cover the fare. And you and I will talk about that north pasture. You and I built this valley, son." Jeremiah drank off his coffee. He set the cup down softly, because when a man 6 feet 5 inches tall sets down his coffee softly, it means he is holding something in. "Mr. Harlan," he said. His voice was very even. "I will say this once. Mrs. Calloway is under my roof, and she is under my word. Her name does not come out of your mouth again. Not to me, not to any man in this valley. If I hear it from you again, sir, you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation. Finish your coffee. Then you ride off my land." Harlan smiled. He stood. He tipped his hat with perfect courtesy. He walked to his buggy. On the road back, he said to the young lawyer, "He's in love with her. That makes this simpler, not harder." That night, Jeremiah sat alone by the stove. Hannah had gone up. He thought about what Harlan had said. He realized he had never once asked Hannah about her husband. He had lived under the same roof with her for a month and never asked, not from fear, because he had felt she would tell him when she was ready, and he had no right to turn a page of her life before she turned it herself. But now Harlan had turned it for him, and Jeremiah understood something more important. He did not need to know the truth about Edmund Calloway in order to know the truth about Hannah. He had watched her teach Finn to read. He had watched her set a Bible on the kitchen table for Thomas. He had heard her sing to a horse. That was the truth he needed. He took the attorney's letter down from the mantel. He held it in his hands. He did not open it. But he laid it on the kitchen table where she would see it in the morning. A small step, smaller than most, but his. The next afternoon, old Thomas came in from the north pasture on a horse that was not his. His own horse, a 3-year-old bay named Cider, had thrown him. Thomas was holding his chest. His face was the gray of wet ashes. Jeremiah saw him from the porch. He ran. Thomas said each word a scrape. "Boss, rib, can't breathe right." Jeremiah moved to lift him down and carry him to the house. "Jeremiah, don't move him." Hannah's voice from the yard. He turned. She was already walking fast toward them, sleeves pushed up, apron straight. "Don't move him," she said again. "Not yet. If that rib has punctured a lung, moving him will kill him. Bring me the linen sheet from the kitchen closet. Bring me boiling water. Bring me the whiskey from the shelf. And bring me your sharpest knife. Clean blade. Hold it to the fire. Now, please." He did not ask. He went. Finn was already on a horse, riding for the doctor. The nearest physician was 30 miles out, 3 hours to ride, 3 hours to come back. For the next 3 hours, Hannah, in an apron gone red with blood, did things Jeremiah had never seen a woman do. She tore linen into bandages the right way. She pressed Thomas's ribs at a precise angle to keep the bone from driving deeper. She used the heated knife to cut a small incision along the side and release the trapped air. Jeremiah had seen an army surgeon perform that cut once at the Big Hole in 1877. He had watched a man live because of it. He watched another man live now. When the doctor arrived, Thomas was breathing steady. The doctor examined the work already done. He asked 3 times, "Who did this? Who did this work?" Hannah wiped her hands on her apron. Her voice was calm again. "My father was a field surgeon with the Union Army," she said. "He trained me from the time I was 11. When he died at Gettysburg, I worked 4 years in a women's hospital in Baltimore through the war and after. I was 15 when I started. I have not done this work in 8 years. The doctor looked at her a long moment. Then he said, with a respect Jeremiah had never before heard a white doctor use toward a woman, "Mrs. Calloway, this man would be dead if not for you. Thank you." Thomas lived. That night, after the doctor had gone and Thomas was sleeping in the spare room on the ground floor, Hannah and Jeremiah sat on the porch. The stars over Montana were very bright. She poured tea for both of them. Her hands still shook faintly from the hours with Thomas. "Jeremiah," she said, "I should have told you before, about Edmund. Will you hear it now?" He nodded. She told him. Edmund Calloway had been a clerk at a bank in St. Louis. A gentle man, no hero, just an ordinary decent man. The bank's senior officer, a man named Harold Merriweather, had embezzled $6,000 and fled to Mexico. Before fleeing, he had doctored the ledgers to place the blame on Edmund. Edmund was charged. The trial had not yet opened. Edmund could not carry the shame. One February night, he used his own revolver. Hannah told the story without crying. "I do not blame him, Jeremiah," she said. "But I grieve that he thought dying alone was easier than living in shame beside me. That is the cruelty of pride. I would have walked with him through anything." Then she told him about Ellie, the 10-month-old, the scarlet fever. 3 nights without sleep. The moment the child stopped breathing in her arms, she said, eyes fixed on the dark sweep of the pasture. "I have nursed dying soldiers, Jeremiah, men with shrapnel in their bellies. I could not save my own child. That is the weight I carry. Not that she died. Children die, God knows. But that I, of all people, could not save her." Jeremiah sat still. He understood now. It was not that Hannah was a broken woman. Hannah was a woman who had carried 2 graves across 1,800 miles and still taught an Irish boy to read his letters in a kitchen. He did not hold her. He laid his enormous hand over her small hand, very lightly, not gripping, only touching. He left it there for 1 full minute. Then he drew his hand back. Both of them understood. Something had changed. and there was no way to go back from it. Early January brought a 3-day blizzard that cut the ranch off from the world. Finn and Thomas stayed down at the bunkhouse. In the main house, there were only Jeremiah and Hannah. The second night of the storm, the wind howled outside like a living thing trying to get in. The stove burned high. Hannah sat knitting socks for Finn. Jeremiah sat across from her, repairing a bridle. Neither spoke for 40 minutes. The only sounds were the wind, the click of knitting needles, and the soft rasp of leather under Jeremiah's hands. Then Hannah set down her knitting. "Jeremiah," she said, "may I ask you something I have no right to ask?" He nodded. "The letter on the kitchen table, from your brother's attorney. I've seen it in this house for 3 months. You haven't opened it. May I ask why?" He set the bridle down. He stood up. He crossed to the kitchen. He took the letter from the table. He came back and sat down again. He looked at the envelope for a long moment. "Because if I open it, Hannah," he said, "Caleb is truly gone. And I am not yet ready for him to be truly gone." Hannah did not answer right away. She placed her knitting on the seat of her chair. She stood up. She walked to him. Then she did something she had never done in her life to any man who was not her father or her husband. She sat down on the floor in front of his chair, very quietly, and leaned her head against his knee. No embrace, no taking of hands, only the lean, the way a child leans against a parent, the way a person who has walked too far leans against a sturdy wall. Jeremiah did not move for 10 seconds. Then his enormous calloused hand, the hand that had fired rifles at living men, came down very slowly onto the crown of her hair. He stroked her hair once. Only once. His fingertips touched the strands the way a man touches a small bird. "Will you read it with me, Hannah?" he said. "I don't think I can do it alone." She opened the envelope. She read it aloud. The letter stated that Caleb had left to the woman called Hannah Calloway, whom my brother will know $200 in cash. The old mare Ruby. And a 10-acre parcel of land along the Bitterroot Creek, so that she may have something of her own, the letter read, in case my brother forgets how to treat a good woman. Jeremiah wept. A man 6 feet 5 inches tall wept beside his stove, his head bowed over the hair of a woman kneeling at his knee. He wept the way a man weeps for a brother he never got around to telling he was proud of. Hannah said nothing. She only kept her head where it was. Her hand rested lightly on the top of his boot. It was a way of saying, "I am here. I am not going anywhere." There was no kiss that night, no declaration of love. But if anyone had ever asked Jeremiah, in the years afterward, about the night he truly married Hannah in his own heart, not the wedding night, but the night before the night, he would have said it was that night, the night of the letter. When the letter was finished, Hannah laid it on Jeremiah's knee. She stood up slowly. She went to the kitchen. She brought back the stack of 5 unsent letters she had placed in her trunk. "These were in Caleb's drawer," she said. "I read them. I should have given them to you before. They are yours, Jeremiah. I'm sorry I kept them." She set them in his hand. She went upstairs. Jeremiah read the letters that night, alone, by the stove. When he reached the 5th, the last, the one never sealed, he read Caleb's words 3 times. "A man does not choose a wife the way he chooses a horse. Come and see. We will all see." Jeremiah sat for a long time. Then he understood the thing he had not let himself understand for 6 months. Caleb had not only sent for Hannah. Caleb had foreseen. Caleb had always intended, in his quiet and generous way, to step aside if the story turned out this way. Caleb had given his blessing before he died. Jeremiah owed his brother no guilt, only gratitude. He folded the letters carefully. He placed them on the mantel, beside the tintype photograph of the 2 brothers. He went to bed. For the first time in 3 months, he slept a whole night through. The storm passed. The snow melted. February came. One morning in mid-February, Hannah was hanging washing on the line across the porch when she heard a horse. She looked up. Not Jeremiah, not Finn, not Thomas. A woman, middle-aged, dressed for town, not country. Her buggy pulled by a single roan. The woman stepped down and walked up to the porch. She held out a basket. "Mrs. Calloway," the woman said. "Yes. I am Eleanor Whitfield. My late husband was the country doctor in this valley for 27 years. My home is 9 miles east. I have brought you bread and a jar of apple preserves. May I sit a moment?" Hannah did not know what to say. She had not had a woman visitor in Montana. She said, "Please, please sit." Mrs. Whitfield sat on the porch. "I heard about what you did for Thomas," she said. "Dr. Harrow told me. He does not praise many women. He praised you. I thought you should know." Hannah did not know where to put her hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," she said. "Eleanor, please." "Eleanor." They sat a while, then Eleanor said quietly, "My husband died 4 years ago. I have one daughter, Lucy. She is 18. I have been lonely, Hannah. Other women have brought me bread. Not one has asked me to sit. I am returning the kindness I did not receive." Hannah's eyes grew wet. Eleanor reached out and took Hannah's hand. "This valley is not made only of the sort of woman who whispers at a stagecoach stop," she said. "There are others. I am one of them. Will you let me come again?" Hannah nodded. She could not speak. She only nodded. When Eleanor drove away an hour later, Hannah stood on the porch and watched the buggy until it was a small mark on the road. For the first time since Ellie died, she had a friend. She had a friend with a name. March came with a late thaw and 3 riders in the yard. Hannah was hanging linens when she heard the hooves. She turned. Sheriff Brody of the county, a young lawyer she did not know, and a third man she had never seen before. The stranger had a familiar face. Edmund's eyes, Edmund's jaw, but older, thinner, with the look of a man who had lost at cards one too many times. Marcus Calloway, Edmund's younger brother. He had vanished after Edmund's death. Now he had reappeared. Marcus stepped down from his horse. He held out a sheaf of papers. "Sheriff Brody has a warrant for this woman's arrest," he said. "She stole $700 from our family before she left St. Louis. There is a sworn statement and a seal of a Missouri County court. The papers are in order." Hannah's hands stopped in the air above the clothesline. Jeremiah came out of the barn. He saw the sheriff. He saw the papers. He started forward. Hannah caught his eye. She shook her head, very small. "Jeremiah," she said, "if you strike a county sheriff, you lose the ranch. Don't." He stopped. His hands closed on the porch rail hard enough that the wood creaked. Sheriff Brody looked down from his horse. Brody was not a bad man, only a tired one. He had 4 children and a wife with consumption, and he did his work because the territory paid him $40 a month. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "the papers are sealed. I have to take you in. Magistrate in Miles City will sort it. If the papers are wrong, you will be out by Thursday." "I understand, Sheriff," Hannah said. She took off her apron. She folded it. She laid it on the porch rail. She let the sheriff put her in irons, in front of Jeremiah. She did not cry. As they rode out of the yard, she said only one thing. "Jeremiah, feed Ruby. She forgets when I'm not there." He nodded. He could not trust his voice. 2 days later, in the Miles City jail, the Miles City Messenger, the paper owned by a friend of Silas Harlan's, ran a column under the byline of an unnamed reporter. "Fallen woman of the Bitterroot, a St. Louis widow's scheme to entrap a rancher." The piece noted that Hannah had lived under Jeremiah's roof for 6 months without benefit of marriage. The piece called her that sort of woman. The piece reminded readers that her husband had been a known thief who took his own life rather than face his judges. The piece suggested she was attempting to draw a respectable former officer into a disgraceful union. The whole valley read it. Pastor Crenshaw, who had married Jeremiah's parents, who had baptized Jeremiah, declined to receive Hannah when she came home. She was released on Thursday as Brody had promised. Marcus had vanished along with the original papers. The magistrate had nothing to prosecute. The magistrate apologized to her privately. He could not apologize to her in public. On Friday morning, Mrs. Henderson at the Miles City General Store told her clerks not to sell flour to that kind. The wives of the other ranchers did not greet her on the road. Hannah came home. She did not go into the house. She walked straight to the barn. She sat down beside Ruby. She stayed there from morning until night without eating. At dusk, Jeremiah came into the barn. He sat down beside her. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Hannah, come into the house, please," she said flatly. "Jeremiah, if I stay here, I will destroy you. Harlan will not stop. He paid for those papers. I know he did. I do not know how to prove it, but I know. And I know him. He will do it again and again, each time a little harder, until you have lost the ranch and your name. Every day I am here is a day you lose a little of your name. The kindest thing I can do now is to go. Hannah, this house is worth nothing if you are not in it." She did not answer. She bowed her head. She did not sleep in her room that night. She stayed in the barn. The next morning she packed her trunk. She left a letter on the kitchen table. 3 lines. "You were the kindest man I have ever known. I cannot repay that kindness by destroying your name. I am taking Ruby and the money Caleb left for me. Do not follow. Hannah." She rode out of the ranch at first light. She went west. She did not know where she was going. Jeremiah woke. He read the letter. He did not panic. He walked into Caleb's room. He took the 5 unsent letters from the mantel. He read them again, one by one. When he reached the 5th, the last, he read Caleb's words a 4th time. "A man does not choose a wife the way he chooses a horse. Come and see. We will all see." He sat on the edge of Caleb's bed. He wept for the 2nd time in his adult life. But not to mourn, to understand. Caleb had sent Hannah not just for himself, but for both of them. Caleb had known. Caleb had known from the start that it was his brother who most needed Hannah's healing. And Caleb, with his wide heart, had always intended to step aside. This was the last gift of his brother. Jeremiah stood. He took down his rifle. Not to shoot any man. In Montana in March there were still wolves. He saddled his best horse. He rode for Miles City. Hannah had ridden into Miles City by a different road. She did not buy the westbound ticket she had planned. Along the way, she had stopped at the corner of the street where 6 months before she had knelt in the mud. She had stood there 5 minutes. Then she had turned and she had walked to the newspaper office. Not the Miles City Messenger. Harlan's paper, the other one. The Bitterroot Herald, a smaller sheet run by a Scotsman named Angus McCrae. He had come to Miles City in 1879 from Edinburgh by way of Boston, carrying a printing press and an old-fashioned belief that the work of a newspaper was to print the truth, not whatever the highest bidder wished printed. She knocked on the door of the Bitterroot Herald. McCrae looked up from his press. He was a man of 50 years, white beard, ink on his cuffs. "Mr. McCrae," Hannah said. "Mrs. Calloway, I read about you in Monday's paper. I did not believe a word of it." Hannah laid on his desk every letter Edmund had written her during their 2 years of marriage. Copies of the St. Louis bank ledgers she had kept. The name Harold Merriweather, the real embezzler now living in Monterrey, Mexico. A former clerk of Edmund's had written to her a year after Edmund's death to tell her the truth he had not dared to tell in court. And most important, a receipt Marcus Calloway had dropped the morning of the arrest. A receipt for payment, signed Silas Harlan, $200. Angus McCrae read the receipt. He looked up. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his Scottish voice low, "this is not a story. This is a confession." "Mr. McCrae," Hannah said, "print the whole truth, not for my sake. For the sake of every woman in this territory who has been called a name she did not earn. And when you print it, print this too. I am going back to the Double S Ranch. Not because a man has asked me to, because I choose to." McCrae looked at her a long moment. He was a Scotsman. And Scotsmen have the look of men who have watched many generations of women crushed under the wheel of history. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I will print every word of it. And madam, welcome to Montana." When Hannah stepped out of the newspaper office, Jeremiah was standing across the street. He had spent the better part of an hour riding from hotel to hotel in Miles City, looking for her, not finding her, asking at the livery, asking at the station, at last asking himself where she would go if she had decided to fight. He had thought the Herald, of course, the Herald. He had ridden to the corner. He had dismounted. He had tied his horse. He did not run. He walked, slowly, the way a man walks to meet his fate, across the wide dirt of the main street, until he stood in front of her. She looked up at him. They were at the very corner where 6 months before she had knelt in the mud and said the words that had changed both of their lives. Jeremiah looked at her, and then at that very corner, Jeremiah knelt down. The second time in his life, he had knelt for a woman. The same corner. But this time, not to raise her up. This time to ask the question he had not dared to ask 6 months before. Passers-by stopped. A boy dropped a paper-wrapped parcel. An older woman passing by, perhaps the same bonneted woman from 6 months before, perhaps another, stood rooted. Jeremiah took off his hat. He held it against his chest. He spoke loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Hannah Calloway," he said. "6 months ago you knelt in the mud at this very corner and you asked me for a roof over your head. I told you then that you would not kneel for anyone again. I kept that word. But I did not keep it well enough, because I let you ride out of my house alone, and a man who keeps his word does not let that happen. So I am kneeling here now, not to ask your forgiveness. You have done nothing needing forgiveness. I am kneeling to tell you 3 things. He drew a breath. First, my brother loved you before I ever met you, and he sent you here because he understood before I did that I needed you more than he did. That was his last gift. I have only just read it. A second breath. Second, I am not asking you to marry me to save your name. The paper is going to save your name, and Mr. McCrae is going to do the rest. I am asking you to marry me because you are the first person since the war who has made me want to be the man I was before it. I have been a shadow for 4 years. You have called me back. I would like to spend whatever years God gives me being the man you called back." A third breath. "Third, if you say no, I will take you to California myself. I will give you every dollar I have. I will not speak a single ill word of you to any living soul. You do not owe me a thing. You never did." He stopped. He looked up at her. "Hannah, what do you want?" Hannah looked down at him. She looked at the people watching. She looked at the corner of the street where she had knelt 6 months before. She thought of Ellie. She thought of Edmund. She thought of Caleb, who had died and left her a horse and a blessing. She did not let him stand up alone. She knelt down with him, as an equal, the way 2 people who have each broken and each stood on their own now choose to stand beside one another. She reached for his hand. "Jeremiah Sutton," she said, "I want to go home, our home." He closed his hand around hers. A boy in the crowd clapped once, then stopped, uncertain whether it was the right thing to do. An old rancher who had served with Jeremiah's father at Shiloh took off his own hat. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stood in her doorway. She had heard every word. She said nothing. But that afternoon, when Jeremiah and Hannah went into the store to buy supplies for the ride home, Mrs. Henderson filled Hannah's order herself, with the finer milled flour. She would not meet Hannah's eyes, but she weighed the flour a little generous. A small step, smaller than most, but hers. 3 days after they rode home, the Bitterroot Herald hit every store and post office in the valley. The front page story ran 4 columns. The true account of Mrs. Hannah Calloway. Angus McCrae wrote it himself. He printed Edmund's letters. He printed the St. Louis Ledger copies. He printed the name Harold Merriweather and the address in Monterey. He printed the receipt, Harlan's signature, $200. He printed it all. And at the end of the article, in plain type, he wrote, "This paper has been the subject of pressure from interests in this valley who believed the truth could be bought. It cannot. Not here. Not by them." A woman was called a name she did not deserve. That name was paid for with money. The woman who paid for her own name back has more honor than the man who tried to take it. The woman is Hannah Calloway Sutton of the Double S Ranch. She is a former nurse of the Union Army Women's Hospital at Baltimore. She saved the life of a man in this valley 6 weeks ago. She teaches 3 children their letters at her kitchen table. She is, by any measure, a credit to this territory. The man who paid $200 is Silas Harlan of the Bar H. He owes this paper an answer. He owes the valley more. He will not get the satisfaction of ignoring us. The valley read it. By the end of April, Silas Harlan had sold the Bar H. He moved to Denver. No one in the Bitterroot Valley spoke his name again. Pastor Crenshaw came out to the Double S on a Tuesday in April. He carried a basket of bread his wife had baked. He did not apologize in words. Men of his generation did not apologize in words. But he took off his hat at the door. He said, "Mrs. Sutton, ma'am, may I come in?" Hannah stepped back from the door. She said, "Of course, Pastor. Please, coffee?" He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Finn and Thomas were learning to read. He drank a full cup. He said at last, "I was wrong, ma'am. I will not find the words to say how wrong. I can only say it plain. I was wrong. I will not be wrong again." Hannah said, "Pastor, would you marry us here in May under the oak by the creek?" Pastor Crenshaw closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, "it would be my honor." They were married on the first Sunday of May, 1882, 6.5 months after Hannah had stepped down from the stagecoach in Miles City. The wedding was held on the pasture of the Double S, under the old oak that Jeremiah's father had planted the year he married Jeremiah's mother. The bluebells were in bloom, the very flowers Caleb had written about in his first letter to Hannah. Who came? Old Thomas, recovered now, walking with a cane, dressed in his only suit, carrying the German Latin Bible Hannah had given him. Finn Callahan, 18 years old, dressed in the first proper suit of his life, his hair combed 3 times, standing up to read aloud the passage Hannah had taught him through the winter, the first chapter of the book of Ruth. He read slowly. He stumbled on 1 or 2 words. No one laughed. Everyone stood still. It was the most beautiful moment of the service. Angus McCrae came up from Miles City to serve as best man. He carried a bottle of Scotch whiskey to be opened afterward. Eleanor Whitfield, widow of the country doctor, Hannah's first woman friend in Montana. She brought a lace-edged tablecloth she had hemmed herself. Her daughter Lucy stood beside her. Lucy was 18 with quiet eyes and her mother's grace. Finn had been looking at Lucy all through the spring. 2 crow families. Mrs. walks beside water and her husband 3 hawks, their daughter Mary, 6 years old, and 3 hawks' cousin Many Rivers with his wife. Jeremiah had invited them 3 weeks before the wedding. He had ridden out to their camp alone with no written contract, and he had said this: "This was your land before it was my father's. My father knew that, but he did not know what to do about it. I know what to do about it. If your horses need grass, they have grass on the north pasture. For as long as my name is on the deed, that is all. You do not owe me $1. You do not owe me a word. This is not charity, and it is not friendship yet, because we do not yet know each other. It is only what is right. If you are willing, come to my wedding in May and break bread at my table. After that, we will see what we are to each other." 3 hawks had looked at him a long moment. Then 3 hawks had said, "You are not your father." Jeremiah had said, "No, sir, I am not." 3 hawks had said, "Good." Pastor Crenshaw officiated. He wore his best coat. His hands trembled a little as he opened his book. He said the words a man says when he is asking the world for a second chance. McCrae read the passage from Ruth in his low Scottish voice. "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge." Jeremiah spoke his own vows, written out the night before, not smooth, stumbling here and there, but true. "Hannah, I do not promise you an easy life. I promise you a true one. I do not promise you I will never fail. I promise you that when I fail, I will come back and face you, not hide from you. I do not promise you children. God gives children, not men, but I promise you this. Every child that walks through the door of this house, born, orphaned, or chosen, will be loved the way my brother was loved, and the way your Ellie was loved. In this house, no child will ever feel small." Hannah answered, quieter but clear. "Jeremiah, I came to Montana with a torn trunk and a dead name. You gave me back my name, and more. You gave me back the right to hope. I promised to love you the way women who have buried someone love. Slower, quieter, harder to break. That is the only kind of love worth giving to you. They did not kiss right away. They held each other, long. Jeremiah rested his cheek on the top of her head. She listened to his heartbeat slow. Then they kissed. The people on the grass cheered. Finn cheered loudest. Mary Crow, 6 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked something in Crow. Her mother answered in Crow. Mary looked up at Jeremiah and Hannah with wide, dark eyes. That night they held the supper in the yard. Eleanor had brought 2 roast chickens. Thomas had cooked beans the way his mother had taught him in Alabama. Finn and Lucy served the plates together, shoulder to shoulder, and when Finn spilled a spoon of beans on the ground, Lucy laughed and bent down to help him, and Finn's face went the color of a sunset over the bighorns. 3 hawks ate the chicken and nodded approval. Many rivers brought a drum and played a song. Mrs. Walks Beside Water sang low over the fire. The song was not a wedding song. It was a song about the river in spring. But a song about a river in spring is a wedding song if you listen. McCrae opened the whiskey. He poured small cups all around. He stood. To Mrs. Sutton, he said, who taught this valley that a name cannot be bought. And to Mr. Sutton, who knelt twice for the same woman, once to lift her up and once to ask her to stay. May their house be full of children of every kind. May their door be open to every traveler. And may the wind, when it comes down out of Canada with its teeth, find nothing in this valley it can tear. The cups went up. The valley drank. A week after the wedding, Jeremiah and Hannah walked out together to the 10-acre parcel Caleb had left her along the creek. The bluebells were still in bloom. The small oak Caleb had mentioned stood at the bend of the water. Jeremiah had built something there while Hannah was not looking. A simple wooden bench, broad enough for 2. He had built it from pine he had cut on his own land. He had used his own hands. He had done the work alone, late in the evenings, through the winter when Hannah thought he was in the barn. He led her to the bench. Caleb left this land for you, he said. The bench is from me, for when we both need a place to rest. I thought, if we have a quarrel someday, if the world gets loud, if one of us gets tired, we walk out here, we sit, we do not talk until we are ready. Is that all right? Hannah sat down on the bench. She patted the wood beside her. Sit with me, she said. He sat. They looked at the creek. She took his hand. Jeremiah Sutton, she said. We are going to sit on this bench a great many times in this life. I hope so, Mrs. Sutton. I do too. They did not speak for half an hour. The creek ran over the stones. The bluebells moved in the wind. Somewhere upstream, a meadowlark sang, and that was the end of the first season of their married life. In the summer of 1882, Hannah opened a school. It happened almost by accident. Finn had been learning his letters for 8 months. Thomas had been reading beside him. Mary Crow, who came over with her mother on washing days, had picked up the alphabet listening at the kitchen door. When Mary was 7, she asked in careful English, Mrs. Sutton, may I learn more? Hannah said yes. By September, there were 6 children at her kitchen table. By October, the kitchen table was not large enough. Jeremiah and Thomas spent 2 weeks clearing out the small cabin Caleb had once built as a study. They put in a stove. A blackboard Jeremiah ordered from Helena. 4 long benches Finn helped plane. They called it the Double S Schoolhouse. Hannah taught 3 mornings a week. Reading, writing, sums, and for the children who wanted it, Latin. By the spring of 1883, the schoolhouse had 14 children. 5 were children of neighboring ranchers. 2 were Crow children, Mary and her younger brother Little Cloud. 1 was Finn Callahan himself, 20 years old, still studying evenings. He was reading Shakespeare now. He had just finished Much Ado About Nothing, and he was courting Lucy Whitfield with an earnestness that made Eleanor smile every time she saw them together. 1 was old Thomas, 63 years old, reading fluently, writing the memoir of his years in slavery in Alabama before the war. Hannah had promised to help him bring it to McCrae when it was finished. Thomas wrote at night by a single lamp. He did not rush. The work of remembering could not be rushed. And two were the adopted children of Jeremiah and Hannah. Little Thomas came first, 3 years old, named for Old Thomas. His parents, an Irish family in Miles City, had died of consumption in the winter of 1883. There had been no one to take the boy in. Eleanor had written to Hannah. Hannah had driven to town the next morning. She had come home with the child in her arms. Caitlin came in the spring of 1884, 5 years old, red hair like Caleb's, orphaned from a migrant wagon coming down through the Dakota country. A man had left her on the Double S porch with a note pinned to her coat. Her name is Caitlin. Her mother died last week. I cannot keep her. Hannah had read the note. She had looked at the girl. She had knelt down. Caitlin, she had said, my name is Hannah. You are safe here. Are you hungry? The girl had nodded. That first night, Caitlin had climbed into Hannah's lap without being taught, and she had called her Mama. Hannah had placed her hand on the child's back. She had understood something she had refused herself to understand for 6 years. A mother is not the woman who bears the child. A mother is the woman who chooses to stay. Hannah had not borne a child of her own. The damage from Ellie's birth had left its mark. But there were 2 children in her house who called her Mama, and more who called her Mrs. Sutton, and a whole valley of children at her blackboard. It was enough, and more than enough. Jeremiah had opened his brother's letter a year after the wedding. The will was simple. Caleb had left him a 7-acre parcel along the creek, upstream from Hannah's parcel. The parcel held a small oak. In the margin of the will, Caleb had written in his crooked, boyish hand, "For when my brother finally learns how to rest." Jeremiah read those words. He closed the will. He walked out to the 7 acres. He stood under the small oak. He thought about what rest meant. He had never known. Since the war, he had not known. But he thought perhaps now he was beginning to. He built nothing on the parcel. He did not cut it. He did not plant it. He let it be. Sometimes he walked out alone and sat under the oak and listened. The meadowlarks, the creek, the wind. He found, after a time, that he could listen without his chest feeling tight. That, he decided, was what rest was. In May of 1885, an ordinary afternoon at the Double S, Jeremiah came home earlier than usual. He put the horse in the barn. He crossed the yard. He stopped at the schoolhouse door. The door stood open. The May wind carried the scent of bluebells inside. Hannah stood at the front of the room before her 14 children. Her hair was pinned up. Chalk dusted her apron. She was reading aloud, not scripture, not arithmetic, not a speller. She was reading Virgil in Latin, the passage from the 6th book of the Aeneid, where Aeneas meets his father again in the underworld. The children did not understand Latin. They loved the sound of it. They sat very still, eyes wide, listening to her voice rise and fall over the syllables of a language that had been dead for 2,000 years. Mary Crow, now 8 years old, was mouthing the words after her. Jeremiah stood in the doorway. He did not go in. He thought of the woman who had knelt in the mud of Miles City 3.5 years before. The woman with the torn glove, the eyes of someone who had finished crying, the trunk tied with a piece of rope. Now she was reading Virgil. To the children of the Crow, the Irish, the cowhand, and the orphaned, all seated together in one room, in a Montana valley, in 1885, where only 10 years earlier men had shot at each other over creek water. She looked up. She saw him. She smiled. The whole smile now, not broken. The smile of a woman who had been loved long enough to believe she deserved it. She said nothing. He said nothing. Caitlin, 6 years old now, turned her head, saw him, grinned, and waved. "Papa!" Jeremiah waved back. He did not go in. He let the lesson continue. He walked out to the porch. He sat down on the top step. He waited. He thought, this is what it was for, all of it. The war, the brother gone, the letter unopened for 3 months, the wind with teeth, the mud of Miles City. All of it was for this. He put his hands on his knees. He watched the bluebells move in the pasture. He waited for his wife to finish the lesson. That evening, Jeremiah and Hannah walked out to Caleb's parcel. The bench sat where Jeremiah had built it, weathered now, the wood gone silver gray. The creek ran full with the May snowmelt. They sat on the bench. They drank coffee from 2 tin cups. They did not speak for a long while. The meadowlark sang somewhere upstream. At last, Hannah said, "Do you remember what I said to you in Miles City, the first time?" "Every word," Jeremiah said. "I can cook. I can clean. Please don't send me back." "Yes, I meant it as a plea that day," she said. "I did not know yet that it was a promise to the only life I had left." Jeremiah did not answer right away. He watched the creek. Then he said, "Hannah, people think I knelt down in that mud to save you. I did not. I knelt down because I had nothing left to give, and I needed to kneel. I was finished that morning before I ever saw you. I just did not know it." She looked at him. "You saved me," he said, "not the other way. Or if you want the truth, we saved each other in the mud, before either of us knew a name." She took his hand. They sat until the light went gold on the water. Then they walked home, slow, along the edge of the pasture. The summer of 1885 was a good summer. The corn came in tall. The cattle put on weight. Finn and Lucy married in June, in the same spot under the oak where Jeremiah and Hannah had married. Pastor Crenshaw officiated. He did not stumble on any words this time. Little Thomas learned to ride his own pony. Old Thomas finished the first draft of his memoir and brought it to McCrae. McCrae read it in one night. The next morning he told Thomas he would print it in installments every Sunday for as long as it took. The first installment ran in July. It began, "My mother taught me to read in secret in the state of Alabama in the year 1831. She told me that a man who could read would never be a man who could be fully owned. I have come to believe her." The Valley read it. Some folks wrote angry letters. Some folks wrote letters of thanks. McCrae printed both. Thomas kept writing. Mary Crow turned 9 in August. Hannah had promised her father 3 years before that Mary would be sent to the high school in Helena when she was 14 if she wished to go. Mary wished to go. Three Hawks had known from the start that she would. In August of 1885, Jeremiah rode out alone to the Crow camp. He brought a paper he had written. He had opened a fund, $600, enough for Mary's schooling, room and board, travel. The paper said the fund was Mary's, in her name, and could not be withdrawn by anyone else. Three Hawks read the paper slowly. He had learned to read English from Hannah. He looked up. He said, "Why, Jeremiah Sutton?" Jeremiah said, "Because my father took this grass from your father, and a man who inherits stolen grass owes a debt. This does not pay the debt. Nothing will. But it is a step, and I am a man who takes steps." Three Hawks folded the paper. He said, "You are not your father." Jeremiah said, "No, sir, I am not." Three Hawks said, "Good." They shook hands. In October, 4 years after the morning Hannah had stepped down from the stagecoach, a letter came to the Double S from St. Louis. Hannah read it at the kitchen table. Jeremiah sat across from her. The letter was from the county clerk of the city court. It concerned the estate of Edmund Calloway. Harold Merriweather, the real embezzler, had been arrested in Mexico and returned to St. Louis. He had confessed. The bank had re-examined the records. Edmund Calloway's name had been cleared 7 years after his death. The estate held $240 that had been frozen since the investigation began. The clerk was writing to return the money to Edmund's widow. Hannah set the letter down. She did not cry. She looked out the kitchen window. The children were running in the yard. Caitlin was chasing little Thomas. Little Thomas was laughing. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes." "I will write to the clerk. I will tell him to send the $240 not to me, to the St. Louis Home for Widows and Orphans, in Edmund's name." Jeremiah nodded. "Edmund did not do what they said he did," Hannah said. "But he did die ashamed. The money cannot give him back his name in his own ears. It can give it back in God's ears." I think he would like that." "Yes," Jeremiah said, "I think he would." She wrote the letter that afternoon. She signed it Hannah Calloway Sutton. She kept both names. Edmonds, because he had been hers once. Sutton, because she was now. On Christmas Eve of 1885, a quiet snow fell on the Bitterroot Valley. The house was full. Old Thomas sat by the stove reading aloud to little Thomas and Caitlin. He was reading from the book of Luke, the Christmas story. Little Thomas was almost 5 now. Caitlin was nearly 7. Both of them leaned against Thomas like he was their grandfather, which in every way that mattered, he was. Finn and Lucy were there. Lucy was expecting their first child in April. Eleanor Whitfield was there, already knitting a small blanket, the white wool piling on her lap. Angus McCrae had come up from Miles City, bringing a crate of books for the schoolhouse and a bottle of scotch for Jeremiah. Pastor Crenshaw came with his wife. They brought bread. 3 Hawks and Mrs. Walks Beside Water came with Mary and Little Cloud. Mary was a foot taller than she had been in the summer. She had written Hannah a letter from Helena every week. She had drawn a picture of her schoolhouse on the back of the last one. 15 people at the long table Jeremiah had built in the big room. Hannah rose. She looked at all of them. She said, "When I came here, I had a torn trunk and a dead name. I was not sure I deserved a seat at any table. Tonight I want to say to each of you that you are a seat in my own life, and I am grateful." She said, "To Jeremiah, who knelt down in the mud and told me I would never kneel for anyone again, and who has kept that word every day since." She said, "To Caleb, who is not at this table but who sent me here, a generous brother and a prophet in his way. May his name be spoken every Christmas in this house as long as this house stands." She raised her cup. "To chosen family," she said, "to the people we did not know we were waiting for, to the ones who walked through our door, or knelt in our mud, or were left on our porch, and who have made us whole." The cups went up, the valley drank. Later, when the children were asleep, Jeremiah and Hannah stood on the porch. The snow had stopped. The sky was full of stars. The kind of sky you only get in a high Montana winter, where the air is so cold and so clear that the stars do not twinkle. They burn. Hannah pulled Jeremiah's old buffalo coat tighter around her. It was the same coat he had put on her shoulders 4 years before in the mud of Miles City. It had been re-sewn twice, but it was the same coat. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes. If I had known that morning in Miles City what the next 4 years would hold, the jail, the paper, the wedding, the children, this porch, this sky, would I have said the same words?" He thought about it. He said, "I don't know, Hannah. I know I would have." She smiled. "Yes," she said. "So would I." They stood together a while longer. Then she said, "The story is not over, is it?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Not by a long road. But it's a good story." "Yes, Mrs. Sutton, it is." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his side. The stars burned over the Bitterroot. And that is where the story ends, and where the life began. People sometimes say in the valley that the first vow Hannah Calloway ever made in Montana was not a wedding vow. It was the vow she made standing in the mud of a Miles City street to a man she did not yet know. "I can cook. I can clean. Please don't send me back." People think those were the words of a desperate woman. People are mistaken. Those were the first vow a woman made to her own new life. A woman who had lost her husband, her child, and her home. Who, standing in the mud of a strange town, did not choose to die. She chose to ask. For a roof. For a place to be useful. For one more chance. Asking is a kind of courage the old hymns do not put into poetry, but it is courage. And the giant of a man who knelt with her, he did not kneel to save her. He knelt to say to her, and to the street, and to history itself in this valley, no one kneels alone any longer. That is how a family began in Montana in the year 1881. That is how families begin anywhere in any time. When two broken human beings choose to rebuild not alone, but together. When a former slave is taught his letters at the kitchen table of a former cavalry officer. When a Crow child studies Virgil beside an Irish child. When a landowner gives back a pasture to those who were there before him, not because the law required it, but because his honor did. This is not a story about a mail-order bride who married a cowboy. This is a story about what people do after the fall, about rebuilding. Slowly, hard, one day at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one reading lesson at a time, one quiet Sunday afternoon at a time, on a wooden bench, a dead brother left behind. What we build after we lose. Not gold, not land, not name. That is the only true inheritance. A schoolhouse, a chosen family. A pasture returned to its first people. A Latin poem read aloud to children who do not understand it but who love the sound of it. And two people who knelt down together and then rose together and then walked on together. Through mud, through snow, through shame, through loss. Into a two-story log house in the Bitterroot Valley, where the October wind still has teeth. But the door always has someone to open it, and there is always hot coffee on the stove for anyone who needs a place to breathe. That is the story. That is the whole of the story. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
My friends, before we part today, let us sit together for 3 minutes longer. Let us talk about what this story truly meant. Hannah Calloway did not come to Montana for love. She came because there was nowhere else to go. She came with a torn glove, a trunk tied with rope, and the eyes of a woman who had finished crying. And when she knelt in the mud of a Miles City street and whispered, "I can cook. I can clean. Please don't send me back," she was not begging. She was doing something far braver. She was choosing to live. That is the first lesson of this story. Asking for help is not weakness. Asking is courage. The old hymns do not put it into poetry. The world does not often applaud it. But the woman who kneels in the mud and says please when she could lie down and die, that woman has more strength in her than most men ever find in a lifetime. And the giant cowboy who knelt beside her, Jeremiah Sutton, taught us the second lesson. A true man does not stand over the broken, he kneels beside them. Jeremiah did not rescue Hannah. He did not lift her up from above. He got down into the mud with her, at the same level, so that when they stood together as equals. That is what love looks like when it is real. Not a hero saving a damsel, two human beings choosing each day to rise side by side. The third lesson is for all of us who have lost someone. Hannah buried a husband. She buried a baby daughter named Ellie. She carried those graves across 1,800 miles. And yet she still taught an Irish boy his letters. She still set a Bible on the kitchen table for a man the church would not seat. She still sang lullabies to a tired old mare. The people we lose do not have to be the end of us. They can become the reason we choose kindness in every small moment that follows. The fourth lesson came from Jeremiah's brother, Caleb, a young man we never met in the flesh, only in 5 unsent letters. Caleb taught us that the greatest love is sometimes the love that steps aside. He sent a woman across the country not only for himself, but for the brother he knew needed her more. That is generosity beyond the grave. That is a heart large enough to bless others even in its own leaving. And the last lesson, the one the schoolhouse taught us. When a former slave learns his letters beside an Irish orphan. When a Crow child studies Latin beside a rancher's daughter. When a pasture is returned to the people who stood on it first, that is what the American West was supposed to be. Not conquest, not cruelty, but ordinary people, choosing one small act of honor after another, until a valley becomes a home for every kind of soul. That is the whole of the story. Thank you for riding this trail with me.